December 25th, 1991. Moscow. The Kremlin. A man stands alone in his office, staring at a speech he's about to give. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and in less than an hour, he will resign as president of a country that no longer exists. Outside his window, Red Square sits under fresh snow. The same square where Soviet troops once marched in victory parades, where Stalin stood atop Lenin's tomb reviewing missiles, where cosmonauts were celebrated as heroes of the socialist future. Tonight, it's almost empty. At 7 p.m., Gorbachev sits before a camera and reads, "Dear compatriots, I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics." 15 minutes later, above the Kremlin, the red flag with the hammer and sickle, the symbol that once flew over half of Europe, that terrified the West for 40 years, that promised a workers' paradise, is lowered for the last time. The Russian tricolor rises in its place. The Soviet Union simply stopped. 74 years earlier, the Bolsheviks had stormed the Winter Palace and declared they would remake humanity. They would abolish poverty, class, inequality. They would build a new kind of human being. And for a while, the world believed them. They survived a civil war, defeated the Nazis, put the first man in space, became a superpower that could end civilization with the push of a button. But here's what nobody tells you. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because the system it built to control everything couldn't adapt when control became impossible. So how does a revolutionary dream become a superpower and then collapse without a single shot fired? Stay with me, because this isn't a story about communism versus capitalism. It's about what happens when you try to reshape humanity, and humanity refuses to be reshaped. If one of the greatest empires in history could collapse because it forgot what its people needed, what does that say about ours? Hit subscribe, because this story doesn't end in 1991. Let's rewind. Back before the fall. Back to a frozen empire on the edge of revolution. Close your eyes and picture Russia in 1917. Not the Soviet superpower you've heard about. The Russia that came before. The Russian Empire. One of the largest empires in history, stretching from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. A realm of 150 million people speaking dozens of languages. And it's dying. The Tsar, Nicholas II, sits in his palace at Tsarskoye Selo while his country starves. He's a decent man by all accounts, gentle with his children, devoted to his wife, deeply religious. He's also completely out of touch with reality. Outside St. Petersburg, peasants work land they don't own for aristocrats who've never touched a plow. 90% of Russians are peasants. Most can't read. Most live in villages that haven't changed in centuries. In the cities, factory workers labor 14-hour shifts for wages that barely buy bread. They live in tenements, entire families packed into single rooms. Disease is rampant. Safety standards don't exist. Russia is technically an empire. In reality, it's a feudal system with telegrams, and it's at war. World War I, the Great War. When it started in 1914, the Tsar's generals promised victory in months. Russia had the largest army in the world, millions of men. The Russian steamroller would crush Germany and Austria-Hungary through sheer numbers. Instead, they're being slaughtered. At Tannenberg in August 1914, two entire Russian armies, over 150,000 men, were encircled and destroyed by the Germans. Russian soldiers marched into German machine gun fire in dense columns, like it was the Napoleonic Wars. Officers were aristocrats with no military training, Entire regiments were wiped out before they fired a shot. The Brusilov offensive in 1916 cost Russia over 1 million casualties in a single campaign. By 1917, over 2 million Russian soldiers are dead. Another 5 million wounded or captured. Russian soldiers march to the front without rifles. They're told to pick up weapons from the dead. One soldier's letter home: "We have no ammunition. We attack with bayonets, and the Germans shoot us down like dogs." He didn't come home. Back in Petrograd, what St. Petersburg was called then, women wait in freezing bread lines for hours, only to be told there's no food. A loaf of bread that cost 5 kopecks in 1914 costs 50 by 1917. And then, in February 1917, it snaps. It starts with women. February 23rd, International Women's Day. Female textile workers walk out of the factories and march into the streets demanding bread. "Give us bread! Down with the war! Down with the Tsar!" Male factory workers join them, then students, then soldiers. Within 2 days, 200,000 people are in the streets. The Tsar orders troops to fire on the crowds. Some do. Dozens are killed. But then the Pavlovsky Regiment, elite guards, mutinies. They turn their rifles on their officers and join the protesters. Other regiments follow. By February 27th, the entire Petrograd garrison has mutinied. Nicholas II tries to return from military headquarters. His train is stopped. His generals tell him the truth. The army won't fight for him anymore. On March 2nd, 1917, Nicholas II abdicates. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ends, not with a grand battle, with hungry people saying enough and soldiers refusing to shoot them. A provisional government takes over. Liberal reformers, lawyers and professors. They promise elections, freedom, civil rights. The people celebrate. For about a week. Because the provisional government makes one fatal mistake. They keep fighting the war. And that's when a man steps off a sealed train at Finland Station in Petrograd. His name is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. The world knows him as Lenin, and he's about to change everything. Lenin wasn't supposed to win. When he arrived in Petrograd in April 1917, the Bolsheviks, his revolutionary party, were a fringe group. They had maybe 25,000 members in a country of 150 million. The dominant socialist party was the Mensheviks, moderate, willing to work with the provisional government. They believed Russia needed to go through capitalism before reaching socialism. You can't skip stages of history. Lenin said, "Watch me." Lenin understood something nobody else did. The Russian people didn't want liberal democracy. They didn't want speeches about freedom and constitutions and gradual reform. They wanted bread, they wanted land, they wanted the war to end. Lenin's slogan was genius in its simplicity. Peace, land, bread. 3 words. That's it. The provisional government kept promising reforms after the war. Lenin promised to end the war immediately. The government talked about land redistribution committees that would meet and study and recommend. Lenin said, "The land belongs to you. Take it. It's yours now." And people listened. Throughout the spring and summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks grew. Not because they had better arguments, because they had better promises. Soldiers deserted by the thousands and went home. Why die for a government that wouldn't give them land? Peasants seized estates and divided up the land. Why wait for permission? Workers took over factories. Why let owners profit while they starved? In July, the government launched a new offensive against Germany. It was a disaster. Russian soldiers refused to attack. Units fell apart. The Germans counterattacked and shattered entire divisions. That failure destroyed the provisional government's credibility. By October, the Bolsheviks controlled the Petrograd Soviet. They controlled factory committees. They controlled the soldiers' councils. On October 24th, the government tried to shut down Bolshevik newspapers, arrest their leaders, disarm the workers. Lenin made the decision. We move. Tonight, October 25th, 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't even particularly violent. Bolshevik workers and soldiers, Red Guards, seized key points across Petrograd, telegraph stations, train stations, bridges, the state bank. Most locations surrendered without a fight. At 2 a.m. on October 26th, Red Guards surrounded the Winter Palace, where the provisional government had barricaded itself. The government's defenders, a handful of military cadets, a women's battalion, some Cossacks who left before the fighting started. The Bolsheviks fired a blank shot from the cruiser Aurora anchored in the Neva River. The palace fell within hours, and that night Lenin stood before the Congress of Soviets and declared, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." Just like that, the world's first communist state was born. Taking power was easy. Keeping it turned Russia into hell. Within months, Russia descended into civil war. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves the Reds, controlled Petrograd and Moscow, maybe 10% of Russian territory. Across the vast countryside, armies formed to crush them. The Whites, anti-communist forces, Tsarist generals, liberal Democrats, anarchists, regional warlords, socialist revolutionaries who hated the Bolsheviks, and foreign powers. Britain, France, Japan, the United States, all sent troops and weapons to support the Whites. Russia exploded into chaos. Armies appeared and vanished. Entire regions changed hands overnight. Atrocities on all sides. Executions. Torture. Villages burned. The Bolsheviks responded with the Red Terror. Lenin created the Cheka, the secret police. Their job? Eliminate enemies of the revolution by any means necessary. No trials, no appeals, just execution. The Cheka arrested nobles, priests, merchants, anyone suspected of anti-Bolshevik sentiment. Entire families were shot in basements and buried in mass graves. One Cheka report, matter of fact. In the night of November 7th and 8th, 67 persons were shot. Total for the week, 3 or 41. This was in just one city, and in July 1918, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, the Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and several servants, were executed by Bolshevik guards, shot, bayoneted, their bodies dissolved in acid and thrown down a mine shaft. The old Russia died in that basement. The Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1921. White armies pushed toward Moscow from the south, the east, the north. At one point, the Bolsheviks controlled less territory than medieval Muscovy, but they held on. Why? 3 reasons. First, geography. The Reds controlled the industrial heartland, the cities, the factories, the railroads. Second, organization. Leon Trotsky built the Red Army from nothing. He conscripted soldiers, recruited Tsarist officers, and held their families hostage to ensure loyalty. Third, the Whites were divided. They couldn't agree on what they were fighting for. Some wanted the Tsar back. Some wanted democracy. They spent as much time fighting each other as fighting the Reds. By 1921, the Whites were defeated, but the country was destroyed. Industrial production was 20% of pre-war levels. Cities were depopulated. People fled to the countryside to find food. The bill arrived in 1921. The Volga famine, drought, failed harvests, but also requisitioning. The Bolsheviks had seized grain from peasants to feed the Red Army. Now there was nothing left. As many as 5 million people starved to death. Peasants ate grass, bark, corpses. There are documented cases of cannibalism. Lenin looked at the wreckage and realized, if we don't fix this, the revolution dies. So he compromised. The new economic policy, the NRP. Lenin legalized limited capitalism. Peasants could sell their grain at market prices. Small businesses could operate. The state kept control of heavy industry and the banks, but the rest of the economy opened up. And it worked. The economy stabilized. Food returned to the cities. People stopped starving. But Lenin never got to see what came next. In May 1922, Lenin suffered the first of several strokes. By 1923, he was an invalid, trapped in his body. He spent his final months writing warnings about bureaucracy, about the danger of the party becoming detached from the workers, and especially about one man, Joseph Stalin. Lenin's last testament. Stalin is too rude. I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post. But the warning came too late. On January 21st, 1924, Vladimir Lenin died, and the question everyone in the Communist Party was asking, who replaces him? The obvious answer was Leon Trotsky, brilliant orator, architect of the Red Army. But there was another candidate, a quieter man, a Georgian who'd spent years in the party apparatus, building loyalty, making alliances, eliminating rivals. His name was Joseph Stalin, and he was about to turn the Soviet Union into something Lenin never imagined. Stalin didn't seize power, he accumulated it, while Trotsky gave brilliant speeches and wrote theoretical pamphlets. Stalin controlled the bureaucracy. He appointed loyalists to key positions, built networks across the party. He was General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position everyone thought was administrative, boring, clerical. Stalin turned it into the most powerful position in the Soviet Union. By 1928, Trotsky was in exile. Stalin's other rivals, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, were sidelined or destroyed. Stalin was the undisputed leader, and he had a vision. The Soviet Union in 1928 was still a peasant country, backward, agricultural, weak. Meanwhile, the capitalist West, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, had factories, steel mills, automobiles, modern armies. Stalin looked at this gap and made a decision that would define the next decade. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or we shall be crushed. He called it the 5-year plan. The goal? Industrialize the Soviet Union faster than any country in history. Turn a nation of peasants into an industrial superpower in a single generation. And he didn't care what it cost. The first target was agriculture. The Soviet Union had 25 million small peasant farms. Stalin wanted them collectivized, merged into giant state-run collective farms where the government controlled everything. The logic was elegant on paper. Large farms are more efficient. You can use tractors, mechanize, and the state can take the surplus grain to feed factory workers in the cities. The reality was catastrophic. Peasants didn't want to give up their land, their animals, their autonomy. So Stalin sent in the Red Army and OGPU, the secret police. Families who resisted were labeled kulaks, wealthy peasants, enemies of the people. What made you a kulak? Owning a couple of cows, hiring seasonal labor, sometimes just being successful. Kulaks were arrested, deported to Siberia in cattle cars, sent to labor camps, executed. Entire villages were emptied. Peasants slaughtered there livestock rather than hand it over to the collective farms. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union lost half its cattle, half its horses. The consequences came fast. In 1932 and 33, famine swept across Soviet Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia. The Holodomor. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a consequence of policy. Stalin's government set impossible grain quotas for collective farms. When farms couldn't meet them, the state confiscated everything. Seed grain, personal stores, food for the farmers themselves. Brigades went house to house searching for hidden grain. They used metal rods to probe walls and floors. If they found grain, they took it. If you resisted, you were shot or arrested. By early 1933, entire villages were dying. People ate grass, acorns, bark, leather belts boiled into soup. Bodies lay in the streets, too many to bury. There are documented reports of cannibalism, parents eating children, children eating parents. One survivor's testimony. I saw a woman sitting by the road. She was holding something. When I got closer, I saw she was eating her dead child. She looked at me with empty eyes and kept eating. The Soviet government denied the famine was happening. Foreign journalists who tried to report it were expelled or silenced. Walter Duranty of the New York Times downplayed reports of famine and insisted things were under control. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. Estimates of the death toll vary. 4 million, 7 million. Some historians say 10 million. Stalin called it the cost of progress. But there was grain in government warehouses, being exported to Europe to buy machinery for the factories. The Soviet Union let millions starve to fund industrialization. And the factories? Those got built. Massive steel plants rose in the Urals. Magnitogorsk, a city built from nothing in the middle of nowhere to produce steel for the new Soviet economy. Workers lived in tents while they built the factories, then in barracks. Conditions were brutal. Frostbite, accidents, disease. Safety standards didn't exist. If a worker died, another took his place. Coal mines opened in Siberia, the Donbass. Prisoners from the labor camps dug the tunnels. Many never came out. Entire cities appeared where there had been wilderness. Norilsk, Kolyma, built by Gulag prisoners in the Arctic. The Gulag system expanded massively under Stalin. Labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union. Prisoners built roads, mined gold, cut timber, dug canals. You didn't need to be guilty of anything real, just unlucky. Tell a joke about Stalin? 10 years. Arrive late to work 3 times. Sabotage. 5 years. Be related to someone arrested? Guilt by association. Deportation. The Gulag population reached 2 million by the late 1930s. Millions more passed through. Hundreds of thousands died. And here's the cruelest irony. Much of what the Gulags built was pointless. The White Sea Canal, dug by hand by 170,000 prisoners. Over 10,000 died. The Haumala Canal was too shallow for most ships. It barely functioned. But it was built. And that's what mattered to Stalin. Targets met. Quotas filled. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's paranoia had metastasized into something monstrous. He saw enemies everywhere, in the party, in the military, in the factories, among ordinary workers, even among his closest allies. And so he launched the Great Purge. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin arrested, tried, and executed hundreds of thousands of people. Old Bolsheviks, men who had made the revolution with Lenin, were arrested and tortured until they confessed to absurd crimes. Spying for Germany, spying for Britain, sabotaging the economy, plotting to assassinate Stalin, planning to restore capitalism. The confessions were extracted through torture, beatings, sleep deprivation, threats to family. But they were broadcast as proof of vast conspiracies. Then the accused were shot. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov, heroes of the revolution, now branded traitors and executed. The military was gutted. 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, half of all regimental commanders. Stalin executed the people who would have defended the Soviet Union from invasion, and in 1939 an invasion was coming. But first, Stalin made a deal with the devil. August 23rd, 1939. Moscow, the Kremlin. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop sit across from each other, signing a treaty. On the surface, it's a non-aggression pact. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany promise not to attack each other. But there's a secret protocol. A map of Eastern Europe divided down the middle. Germany gets Western Poland. The Soviet Union gets Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and a free hand in Finland. 2 totalitarian empires carving up the continent like a pie. Stalin toasts the signing with champagne. Ribbentrop flies back to Berlin. Hitler is ecstatic. The West is horrified. Stalin's calculation was cold and pragmatic. Let Germany and the West destroy each other. The Soviet Union will stay out of it and pick up the pieces. It was brilliant. It was also catastrophically wrong. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On September 17, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was crushed between 2 empires. Within weeks, it ceased to exist as an independent country. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to Siberia. In the Katyn forest, NKVD officers executed over 20,000 Polish officers, intellectuals and officials, shot them in the back of the head, and buried them in mass graves. The Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, occupied them, deported their elites to the gulags. Stalin invaded Finland in November 1939. The Winter War. The Red Army, fresh from purges that had killed most of its competent officers, attacked with overwhelming numbers. The Finns fought back with stunning effectiveness. Ski troops in white camouflage, snipers, Molotov cocktails. They inflicted massive casualties on Soviet forces. The Red Army eventually won through sheer attrition, but it was humiliating. The world saw that the Soviet military was weak, disorganized, led by incompetence. Hitler saw it too, and he made a decision. June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 a.m. Along the entire Soviet border, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, German artillery opens fire. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German troops, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft. The objective: destroy the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign. Hitler's generals told him it would take 3 months. The first days were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. German bombers destroyed Soviet aircraft on the ground. Hundreds of planes, parked wingtip to wingtip, obliterated before they could take off. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. At Kiev, 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in a single battle. At Vyazma and Bryansk, another 600,000. Soviet soldiers surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. Stalin had ignored warnings. Soviet intelligence had reported German troop buildups, even the exact date of the invasion. Stalin dismissed it as British disinformation. When the invasion came, Stalin was paralyzed. For 2 weeks, he disappeared, locked himself in his dacha, refused to speak to anyone. His inner circle thought he'd had a breakdown. When he finally returned to Moscow, he made a radio address to the Soviet people. Not as the great leader, not as the all-knowing genius, but as a desperate man. Brothers and sisters, a grave danger hangs over our country. It was the first time Stalin had ever admitted weakness. By October 1941, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. German troops could see the Kremlin spires through their binoculars. The Soviet government evacuated to Kuibyshev, 800 kilometers east. Stalin considered fleeing, but he stayed. And then winter came. The Germans weren't prepared for the Russian winter. Their tanks froze. Engines wouldn't start. Fuel turned to sludge. Soldiers died from frostbite. Fingers, toes, noses blackened and fell off. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees, and the Red Army, battered, desperate, learning fast, counterattacked. Fresh divisions from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, hit the German flanks outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht, exhausted and frozen, fell back. Moscow didn't fall. It was the first major German defeat of the war, but the Germans adapted. In spring 1942, they launched a new offensive south toward the Caucasus and its oil fields. And then the Germans reached Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River, strategically important, symbolically crucial. It bore Stalin's name. Hitler ordered it taken. Stalin ordered it held. What followed was the most brutal urban battle in history. Picture Stalingrad in autumn 1942. The city is rubble. German bombers have reduced it to ruins. But ruins make good fortresses. Soviet soldiers, trapped with their backs to the Volga, turn every building into a strong point. Every floor, every room. The fighting is close quarters. Rooms change hands 5, 6, 7 times in a single day. Soldiers fight with rifles, grenades, knives, shovels, bare hands. A German officer's diary. We have fought for 15 days for a single house. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. From story to story, faces black with sweat. We bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. The Soviets have a saying, the distance between life and death in Stalingrad is one grenade throw. Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet general defending the city, gives orders. Fight the Germans so close they can't use their artillery and air support. And it works. German soldiers, trained for blitzkrieg and open battle, are forced into grinding attrition warfare in the ruins. The Soviets pour reinforcements across the Volga at night. Many drown or are killed by German fire before reaching the city. Average life expectancy for a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad, 24 hours. But they keep coming. November 19th, 1942. The Soviet counteroffensive. While the Germans were focused on Stalingrad, Soviet forces massed north and south of the city. Under Marshal Zhukov's command, they launched Operation Uranus. 2 massive pincers. They smashed through the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks and met behind Stalingrad. The entire German 6th Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. Hitler ordered them to hold, promised air supply. It never came. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver enough food and ammunition. The pocket shrank. Men starved, froze, died of typhus. By February 1943, it was over. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. 91,000 German soldiers, all that remained, went into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 ever returned home. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. From that moment, the Red Army pushed west. They retook Ukraine, Belarus, Poland. Every mile was paid for in blood. The Soviets lost 27 million people in World War II. Soldiers and civilians, men, women, children. Entire cities were wiped off the map. Leningrad starved for 872 days under siege, over 1 million dead. Minsk lost 90% of its population. Villages were burned, families executed by German death squads. But the Red Army kept advancing. In April 1945, Soviet artillery began shelling Berlin. 2 million Soviet troops surrounded the city. They had 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. Inside Berlin, Hitler sat in his bunker beneath the Reichstag, watching his 1,000-year Reich collapse. Soviet troops raised the red flag over the Reichstag on April 30th, 1945. That same day, Hitler killed himself. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. Nazi Germany was defeated, but the Soviet Union had won the war at a cost that almost destroyed it. 27 million dead, 70,000 villages destroyed, 32,000 factories, infrastructure obliterated. Stalin sat across from Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta and Potsdam, and they saw a victorious leader of a great power. They didn't see the truth. The Soviet Union was bleeding. But Stalin played it perfectly. He demanded control over Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. The logic was clear. Never again would the Soviet Union be invaded from the West. A buffer zone, friendly governments, Soviet security above all. Roosevelt, dying and tired, agreed to Soviet spheres of influence. Churchill saw what was happening and hated it. In March 1946, he gave a speech in Missouri. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. He was right. Within 3 years, communist governments controlled Eastern Europe, some through elections, rigged, most through Soviet military occupation. The Cold War had begun. 2 superpowers, 2 ideologies, each convinced the other wanted to destroy it. The United States had atomic weapons. In August 1945, they'd incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stalin ordered Soviet scientists to build their own bomb, at any cost. In August 1949, the USSR tested its first atomic weapon. The arms race began. Hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes, enough weapons to end civilization a dozen times over. But they never used them. Instead, they fought proxy wars. Korea, Vietnam, Angola. Each superpower backing opposite sides, pouring in weapons, watching the body count rise. And they competed in other ways. The space race, October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, a metal sphere 58 centimeters across, beeping as it orbited Earth. The West panicked. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead in orbit. American cities were vulnerable. April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. I see Earth. It is so beautiful. Gagarin orbited once and landed safely. The Soviet Union had beaten America again. For a moment, it looked like the future belonged to communism. Khrushchev, who'd taken power after Stalin died in 1953, declared, "We will bury you." Not a threat, a prediction. The Soviet system would outlast capitalism. But beneath the propaganda, cracks were appearing. Nikita Khrushchev did something unprecedented in 1956. At the 20th Party Congress, he gave a secret speech denouncing Stalin, the cult of personality, the purges, the executions, the lies. Stalin acted not through persuasion, explanation, and patient cooperation with people, but by imposing his concepts and demanding absolute submission to his opinion. It was a brief moment of honesty. The speech leaked. It spread across the Soviet bloc. People read it and realized everything we were told was a lie. In Hungary, people rose up demanding freedom. Soviet tanks crushed the uprising. 2,000 dead. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Prague Spring, a reform movement, was crushed by Warsaw Pact forces. The message was clear. You can criticize Stalin, but you can't leave the system. Khrushchev tried to reform the economy. Decentralize. Give local managers more authority. It didn't work. The system was too rigid, too bureaucratic. In 1964, the party ousted Khrushchev. He was forced to retire. Leonid Brezhnev took power. And under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union entered the era of stagnation. Command economies are great at mobilizing resources for specific goals, building tanks, rockets, dams. They're terrible at making life better for ordinary people. By the 1970s, Soviet citizens lived in a bizarre paradox. The USSR was a superpower. It had nuclear weapons, a space program, a massive military. But in Moscow, people waited in line for hours to buy bread. Apartments were cramped, entire families in 2 rooms. Consumer goods were shoddy or non-existent. If you wanted a car, you put your name on a waiting list. And waited. 5 years, 10 years. If you wanted quality goods, jeans, coffee, electronics, you bought them on the black market. Corruption was endemic. Factory managers falsified production numbers to meet quotas. Officials took bribes. Everyone stole from the state because the state was stealing from everyone. The joke in the Soviet Union: we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Economic growth slowed to near zero. Innovation stopped. The Soviet economy became a zombie, not alive, not dead, just going through the motions. And the regime responded with repression. The KGB arrested dissidents, writers, activists, anyone who questioned the system. Solzhenitsyn, who'd written about the gulags, was exiled. Sakharov, the physicist who'd helped build the Soviet hydrogen bomb and then became a human rights advocate, was confined to internal exile. Ordinary people who spoke out disappeared into psychiatric hospitals or labor camps. The system couldn't tolerate criticism, because criticism threatened the entire structure. But suppression doesn't stop people from thinking, it just makes them quiet. And then the USSR made the mistake every empire makes right before it breaks. It picked the wrong war. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The logic seemed sound. A communist government in Kabul was under threat from Islamic insurgents. Soviet troops would go in, stabilize the situation, and leave within months. It didn't work. Afghan guerrillas, the Mujahideen, fought back, funded by the United States and Saudi Arabia, armed with weapons smuggled through Pakistan. They turned Afghanistan into the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Soviet soldiers fought in brutal mountain warfare, ambushes, roadside bombs, villages that looked friendly but weren't. There was no front line, no clear enemy, no way to win. Soviet troops controlled the cities during the day. At night, the Mujahideen owned the countryside. The war dragged on. 1 year, 2, 5, 10. 15,000 Soviet troops died. 50,000 wounded. Countless more came home with PTSD, addicted to drugs, broken. And back in the USSR, people started asking, what are we doing there? Why are our sons dying for this? The Soviet government had no good answer. The war became a wound that wouldn't heal. It drained resources, destroyed morale, and showed the world that the Soviet military, once feared as unstoppable, could be beaten by farmers with rifles. But it wasn't a war that finished off Soviet trust. It was a power plant. April 26, 1986. 1:23 a.m. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. Reactor number 4. A safety test goes wrong. The reactor overheats, explodes. The reactor core, 1,000 tons of radioactive material is exposed to the atmosphere. A plume of radiation spreads across Ukraine, Belarus, Europe. The Soviet response was catastrophic. They didn't evacuate Pripyat, the town next to the plant, for 36 hours. Residents went about their day while radiation spiked to lethal levels. They didn't warn Europe. Sweden detected the radiation first and asked, "What happened?" The Soviet government lied. A minor accident, under control. Firefighters and plant workers rushed to contain the disaster. Many didn't know they were being exposed to lethal doses of radiation. They wore regular uniforms, no protective gear. They died within weeks. Skin peeling, organs failing, vomiting blood. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath. Thousands more would develop cancer. The Soviet Union tried to cover it up. But you can't hide a nuclear disaster. And Chernobyl revealed something the Soviet people had suspected, but couldn't prove. The government is incompetent, and they lie. If they lied about Chernobyl, what else were they lying about? Trust, already fragile, shattered. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was in crisis. Oil prices, the USSR's main source of hard currency, had collapsed. The Afghan war was bleeding resources. The arms race with the United States was bankrupting the state. The system was on life support. And in March 1985, a new leader emerged. Mikhail Gorbachev, younger, energetic, a reformer. He looked at the Soviet Union and saw a system that couldn't continue. Something had to change, and he made a decision that would doom the empire he was trying to save. He tried to reform it. Gorbachev introduced two policies that sound harmless: glasnost, openness, freedom of speech, transparency, perestroika, restructuring, economic reform, decentralization. The idea was simple. If we let people speak freely and reform the economy, we can save the system, make it more efficient, more humane, more legitimate. But here's what Gorbachev didn't understand. You can't reform a system built on control by removing the control. Glasnost opened the floodgates. For 70 years, the Soviet people had been told what to think, what to say, what to believe. Suddenly they could speak. Newspapers started publishing the truth about Stalin's purges, about the Holodomor, about the gulags, about Chernobyl, about the corruption, about the lies. Television showed documentaries about Soviet history that had been hidden for decades. People who had been afraid to speak suddenly spoke, and they were angry. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, people formed human chains, hundreds of kilometers long, demanding independence. In Ukraine, nationalist movements surged. We are not Russian, we are Ukrainian. In the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, ethnic conflicts erupted. Old grievances, suppressed for decades, exploded. The Soviet Union was held together by fear and force. Once the fear lifted, once people could speak, the empire started to crack. Perestroika was worse. Gorbachev tried to introduce market reforms while keeping the communist system intact. It was like trying to be half pregnant. State-owned factories struggled. They were inefficient, bloated, uncompetitive. But they couldn't be shut down, because that would mean unemployment. Private businesses were allowed, but faced bureaucratic nightmares: corruption, extortion. The result, the worst of both systems. Shortages worsened, inflation spiked, the ruble became worthless. People had money, but there was nothing to buy. Lines for bread stretched for blocks. Stores were empty. The black market exploded. The Soviet economy was in freefall. And then, on November 9th, 1989, The Berlin Wall fell. East Germans had been protesting for months, demanding freedom, demanding the right to travel. The East German government, confused and panicked, announced that citizens could cross the border. Thousands poured into West Berlin. The border guards stood aside. People took hammers and chisels and began tearing the wall apart with their bare hands. The symbol of the Cold War collapsed on live television. Within weeks, communist governments across Eastern Europe fell. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, where the dictator Ceausescu was executed on Christmas Day. One by one, they abandoned the system the Soviets had installed. And Moscow? Moscow did nothing. Gorbachev refused to send in troops, refused to crush the revolutions. He believed the Soviet Union could coexist with a free Eastern Europe. He was wrong, because once the satellites were gone, people in the Soviet Union itself started asking, if Poland can leave, why can't we? By 1990, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. The republics were breaking away. Lithuania declared independence. Then Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine. The economy was in collapse. Store shelves were empty. The government was printing money that nobody wanted. The Communist Party had lost all legitimacy. Gorbachev tried to hold it together. He proposed a new union treaty, more autonomy for the republics, a looser federation. But hardliners in the party saw this as betrayal. On August 19th, 1991, they attempted a coup. The State Committee on the State of Emergency, senior officials, KGB, military leaders. They arrested Gorbachev at his vacation home in Crimea, declared a state of emergency, sent tanks into Moscow. The goal: restore order, reverse the reforms, save the Soviet Union. But something unexpected happened. The people didn't obey. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament and rallied the crowd. We will not allow a return to dictatorship. We will defend democracy. Thousands of Muscovites surrounded the parliament building, human shields. The tank crews refused to fire on civilians. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. The hardliners were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but he returned to a country that no longer existed. The republics declared independence, one by one. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Central Asian republics. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a forest in Belarus and signed an agreement. The Soviet Union was dissolved. Gorbachev wasn't even invited to the meeting. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. At 7:35 p.m., the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor was raised. 74 years. That's how long the Soviet Union lasted. From revolution to superpower to collapse. And the world watched in disbelief. The Soviet collapse didn't happen in a glorious battle. There was no final war, no climactic revolution. It died because nobody believed in it anymore. The soldiers didn't believe. The workers didn't believe. Even the Communist Party officials didn't believe. When Gorbachev tried to save the system by opening it up, he discovered there was nothing left to save. The Soviet Union was a shell, a bureaucracy running on inertia, held together by lies that everyone knew were lies. And the moment people stopped pretending, it vanished. No final stand, no heroic last defense. Just silence. Empires don't die when they're defeated. They die when people stop obeying. And on December 25, 1991, the Soviet people stopped. But empires don't disappear cleanly. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it left behind 15 new countries. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Caucasus republics, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Some transitioned to democracy, others became dictatorships. Russia itself descended into chaos. The 1990s in Russia were brutal. The economy collapsed. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Pensioners who'd worked their entire lives found their pensions worthless. State assets were sold off for pennies. Oligarchs, well-connected insiders, looted the country, bought entire industries, became billionaires overnight. Crime exploded. The mafia controlled entire cities. Contract killings were common. The state barely functioned. Life expectancy dropped in a developed country, in peacetime. People who had lived under Soviet stability, however oppressive, suddenly found themselves in a world with no rules, no safety net, no future. And many Russians looked back at the Soviet era with nostalgia, not because it was good, but because at least it was predictable. At least there was order. At least there was bread. In 2000, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin became president of Russia. And he's been in power ever since. Putin doesn't want to rebuild the Soviet Union, but he wants to rebuild Russian power, Russian pride, Russian control over its neighbors. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. These aren't random. They're the ghost of the Soviet Union trying to reassert itself. Putin grew up in the Soviet system. He called its collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Not the purges, not the gulags, not the famines, the collapser. And he spent 2 decades trying to reverse it. The USSR also left behind environmental disasters. Chernobyl, still radioactive, still dangerous. The Aral Sea, once the 4th largest lake in the world, drained for Soviet cotton farms. Now a toxic desert. Nuclear test sites in Kazakhstan. Contaminated, abandoned. Chemical weapons, stockpiles, rusting, leaking. It left behind a generation that grew up in a system that promised equality and delivered surveillance, shortages, and fear. People who learned not to trust the government, not to trust the news, not to trust anyone. That cynicism didn't disappear with the Soviet Union. It's still there, and it left behind a question that still haunts the world. Can you remake humanity? And what happens when you try? So what does it all mean? The Soviet Union tried to build a new kind of society. No more capitalism. No more inequality. A workers' paradise where everyone was equal. And for a while, millions believed. They defeated the Nazis, rebuilt from nothing, put a man in space. But command economies can't deliver what people need. You can't control people forever. Eventually, they stop pretending. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of Ronald Reagan, the CIA, or Star Wars. It fell because the system couldn't deliver what it promised. It promised equality and built a new ruling class. It promised prosperity and built an economy that could make tanks but not bread. It promised freedom from exploitation and needed secret police to keep people in line. Lenin wanted to reshape humanity. Stalin tried to force it. And for 70 years, millions of people pretended it was working. But you can't reshape humanity. You can suppress it, control it, terrorize it. But you can't change what people need: food, safety, truth, and the freedom to say this isn't working without being shot. And when Gorbachev finally let people speak, they said it. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because it was defeated. It collapsed because people stopped lying. The Kremlin still stands. Red Square is still there. The metro Stalin built still runs under Moscow. But the dream, the revolution, the new Soviet man, that died the moment people realized we were never remaking humanity. We were just surviving it. And in the end, survival beat the system. The Soviet Union tried to control history, and history buried it, like a red flag lowered in silence.